And ultimately, why are we talking about protected bike lanes? It's not just because we think they're cool, but it's the kind of safe and comfortable infrastructure that's going to actually shift behavior and get people who might be interested in riding a bike actually use it day to day as a part of their daily transportation choices. So if we're creating that safe, low stress, all ages and abilities network, we can actually help unlock a lot of the sustainability and equity and health benefits that less car centric mobility can bring us.
Welcome to the Cloutcast. I'm Erin Hegarty, and I'll be your host today. Well, the season is finally starting to shift here in Chicago, and we're getting tastes of just how biting that autumn cold wind can be. This week, we're talking about biking, or more specifically, what it takes to build a regional biking network that is safe and that connects people to where they need or want to go. The city's transportation department earlier this year announced its plans for 100 miles of new and upgraded bike lanes between this year and next, and plans for an additional 12 miles of protected bike lanes. That's bike lanes that are separated from car traffic by a barrier, both this year and next year. As these new lanes and new types of bike lanes are rolling out, we wanted to look at what goes into planning for a robust regional network of bike lanes since, let's be honest, Chicagoans don't only ride in the city. We like to head west down the Prairie Path, north on the lakefront, or south to hit up Indiana breweries just over the state line. People also use bikes as their main modes of transportation in getting to and from work and for other daily trips. We'll hear from Daniel Comeaux, Associate Transportation Policy Analyst at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, on the regional planning aspect, and from Jim Merrell, Managing Director of Advocacy for Active Transportation Alliance, on what bike infrastructure looks like in Chicago today. All right, let's get rolling. As a regional planning organization, I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about the work that CMAP does in regional bike planning and perhaps, transportation for, pedestrians, cars, and in general.
Yeah, so CMAP is the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. We're the comprehensive long-range planning agency for Northeastern Illinois. And so our primary activities are that we work with our partner agencies to implement the long-range regional plan, which is Onto 2050. And so a central component of that plan is related to transportation and promoting modes like biking that are sustainable and provide for more options for the region's travelers. And so, one of the things that we do toward implementing the plan is that we help to guide the allocation of federal transportation funding. And so sometimes that's supporting bike infrastructure projects like the Navy Pier flyover, but it's also supporting systems like Divvy. Some funding that came through CMAP helped to support the startup of Divvy in 2013. We also do work to plan for the region's bicycle networks, and that's the biggest example of that is that we have a regional trails and greenways network, which is in the plan, and it's something that we try to guide projects toward completing. And so right now that network is not complete. I think it's about 42% of the mileage is complete. But it's one of the things that we work to in the Onto 2050 plan is ensuring that we continue to make progress toward those sorts of regional networks that we've documented as really important for the region's travelers.
And why is it important to have not only local bike lanes in just your neighborhood, but regional trails and bikeways connecting Chicago with the rest of Chicago and Chicago with, surrounding towns and suburbs as well?
So a lot of people's trips are within their community. And so it's important to have those sorts of local connections like you're pointing to. But for many of the region's travelers, they cross municipal borders or county borders every day. We've done some research before the pandemic when people were traveling to work every day, that 56% of the workers in our region were commuting across county borders every day. And so if we want bicycling to be a realistic option for the region's travelers, then we have to make sure that, we have networks of bicycle facilities that cross municipal and county borders. Just because someone lives in Chicago or lives in Aurora doesn't mean that they don't travel to other places in the region. And so, by having these regional networks, we can ensure that biking isn't just a thing that you might do in your neighborhood. It's a realistic way for you to get around. But at the same time, those local connections are also really important. And so, that's something that we really support, is that you have these regional networks, but then you also have local bike connections that make sure that you can get from your front door to that regional trail, and then from wherever you go on the trail to your final destination, and do it in a way that's safe and comfortable, so that we can make bicycling make people more comfortable biking and make it a more realistic option for the region's travelers.
And what are barriers bicyclists might face that keep them from biking or wanting to bike for everyday trips or for leisure? And are those different in the suburbs versus the city, or are they the same?
They're generally pretty similar, and I think it's a mix of barriers, and some of it is infrastructure related, and some of it is maybe more familiarity and comfort. On the infrastructure side, oftentimes there is no dedicated bike facility, or there might be a bike lane that goes part of the way there, or a bike trail that goes part of the way there, but it stops at some point along the way. And having those connections go all the way is really important whenever we're trying to make sure that people can get from where they are to where they want to be, and to do that by modes like bicycling. Another barrier can often be an inability to park your bike, whether that's not enough bike racks, or people don't they want some sort of dedicated space where they can leave their bike. But there's also comfort and education and familiarity with bicycles. A lot of people in the region do bike and bike regularly, but many more might not know how to bike. They might not have biked in a while. They might have learned to bike when they were a child, and it hasn't been something that they've done regularly since. And so that's a barrier too. And that's where the problems of infrastructure and comfort can sort of interact, because people that are less comfortable or familiar with biking might need more infrastructure or more dedicated assets to feel like biking could be safe for them. And whenever we're thinking about between the city and the suburbs, in general, you might have pretty similar issues. It's going to be those same questions of infrastructure and familiarity. In some cases, the built environment might look different in some of the suburban communities versus the most urban parts of the region. And that might mean that you might have higher speed streets, or drivers that are less familiar with cyclists. And so that can impose some, maybe some different kinds of, or different scale of challenges, but it's still sort of the same thing. But the solutions to those challenges are pretty similar. And so we do see, both in Chicago and in suburban municipalities throughout the region, there are communities that are making really, significant investments in improving their bike infrastructure, whether that's filling, crucial gaps in regional trails, or, making key local streets that might be relatively high speed or high crash into safer facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians. And so in Chicago, we have investments that are going on right now, like a comprehensive bike network in neighborhoods like Belmont-Cragen. We also have large regional scale investments like the Navy Pier flyover that opened fully to bikes and pedestrians relatively recently. But then we also have communities like Evanston that have made significant investments in protected bike lanes on some of their streets that previously had some crash incidents. And we have investments in places like Algonquin, much further away from Chicago, that are still making the same sorts of investments in making their downtown more comfortable and attractive to bicyclists and pedestrians.
And is it only infrastructure that makes a community bike friendly, or is it kind of what you touched on, the familiarity of, pedestrians and drivers or, car operators and bicyclists with the bike network? Is there an education component as well, I guess?
There is, and I think it's both, and they can sort of feed on each other. One example that is often pointed to in bike policy and bike advocacy is looking at the Netherlands. They have a well-known culture of bicycling, and one thing that advocates there will point out is that everyone is a bicyclist, and so they are all, even when the bicyclists are driving cars, they are familiar with they've been there, and so they understand, and so that bike ridership has seen more interest lately, especially with the pandemic, and so that's something where as more people become more familiar with bicycling, either because they've done it or they're just seeing more people on the roads or on the paths bicycling, that is a way of just getting used to this, both as an option that they could take advantage of, and also just as a part of the transportation system that they need to, make sure that they're paying attention to.
And what benefit, I know the benefits that biking can bring to me. It brings me joy, but what benefits can being a bicycle-friendly city or community bring to that city or community, especially when it comes to the environment and the health of individuals and communities and economic growth?
Yeah, so this is a common question. Obviously, from an environmental perspective, bikes are very environmentally sustainable. There's no tailpipe emissions from a bicycle, and so that's very good from a reducing greenhouse gases perspective. It also is important to think about. It reduces the sorts of air pollutants that can lower air quality, which can improve the health of neighboring communities. There's also been studies out of places like Portland, Oregon, that have found that investments in bicycle infrastructure can be really positive from an economic growth perspective. It's important to remember, just like car drivers, bicyclists go to grocery stores and go to the neighborhood bookstore and are buying things there. And so if you can build infrastructure, like bike lanes and bike parking to accommodate those individuals, that's a way of enabling economic activity. And just like you said, this is a mode that promotes physical activity, whether that's as part of you're going on a bike ride for exercise, or you're getting physical activity as part of your commute or your trip to school or to the grocery store. Providing the infrastructure and the familiarity levels that allow for that is a good way of promoting just overall physical health.
How do bikeshare programs like Divvy improve accessibility or help someone who may be not so committed to buy a bike get into biking as a mode of transportation?
Yeah, so Divvy and bikeshare in the region in general have really grown quite substantially over the past decade. I mean, they emerged from nothing to a mode that is quite recognizable to to people traveling, especially people who are in the city of Chicago or in Evanston. And these programs are really, they've been quite popular. They're quite effective. Divvy this year has seen over 4 million rides, which is shattering previous ridership records. And that's with 2 months to go. And so we expect more rides between now and the end of the year. And these programs allow people to gain experience using a bike in a way that they might not do if they had to go out and buy their own personal bike, especially with the shortages of personal bicycles that we've seen lots of news articles about with the pandemic, as this has become such a popular activity. And so programs like Divvy, allow people who might be less familiar or, not as regular with bike riders to get exposure to it as a transportation mode. It also enables you to take a bike, for one direction of a trip, and you might, take transit back or get a ride or walk or whatever else, and so that's in general, we're supportive of ways to promote more options for the region's travelers. And so having Divvy and other bike share systems like Colony in the western parts of the region, or Grays Lake has a bike share program in Lake County. They're assets both for their transportation value, but also because they can, help people experience bicycling. And the investments that we make to support programs like Divvy in terms of new bike parking or bicycle facilities, bike lanes, can also support people that are using their own personal bicycles. So I think that it's, a great asset to the region. It's something that, CMAP has supported, and we're very excited about the success of bike share in the region, and especially the recent expansion. The city of Chicago is rolling out Divvy citywide. They've made substantial progress over the last 18 months in really scaling up the geographic footprint of the system and bringing it into communities that previously were outside of the system. And that's, I think, coupled with the ongoing investments in neighborhood bike networks like is happening in Belmont-Cragen, is a really good way to try to bring the benefits of bicycling to more places in the city and the region.
My name is Jim Merrell. I'm the Managing Director of Advocacy at Active Transportation Alliance. I've been there for over 8 years now. Active Trans, as we call ourselves, is a walking, biking, public transit advocacy organization. So our mission is to promote walking, biking, and transit to create healthy, sustainable, and equitable communities. And my role there is, helping to lead our advocacy team in a bunch of different, strategic campaigns to help influence different policies, different plans, and different projects happening on the city, regional, state, and federal level. So we work across, all levels of government to create the policy and planning conditions to help make walking, biking, and transit easier, more accessible, and more equitable.
Yeah, and today we're here to talk about bike lanes, and in particular, though, perhaps we could, talk about infrastructure that might help with bike safety that isn't necessarily, a bike lane. But I guess my first question is, CDOT, the Chicago Department of Transportation, earlier this year announced that it plans to add 50 miles of bike lanes this year and next year, with a focus on the south and west sides. And officials have said that includes adding 12 miles of protected bike lanes this year and next year. I'm wondering, what Active Trans thinks of those plans. Is it enough? Is it detailed enough at the moment? Or, should it be more detailed? Can it be more detailed? And yeah, is the 12 miles of protected bike lanes each year, is that, adequate, or should there be more?
The recent announcement of the new the new bike investments is really exciting progress. Absolutely. And in particular, as you mentioned, this investment in protected bike lanes. So when we say protected bike lanes, we're talking about any bike lane where there's some kind of physical separation between the bike lane and vehicle traffic. So in Chicago, that looks a few different ways. You can see those plastic bollards, or vertical delineators, as they're called, which I think would be a cool. It could be a cool band name, or maybe like an album. I don't know. Also, sometimes the parking lane is moved out. In addition to those plastic posts, you have parked cars that create a buffer between people driving and people using bicycles. And then you also have in a few places actual concrete curbs. So these are actual curbs added to the roadway to create an even more robust separation. So, when we talk about bike lanes and we talk about protected bike lanes, not all bike lanes are created equal. So when you talk about, the level of detail and the scale of the investment, it really is important to understand not only where is the city planning on putting these miles, but what types of facilities, as the planners would say, what types of improvements are they actually going to make. Because, unfortunately, we've seen, a lot of promises made around protected bike lanes in particular, which we haven't seen met. Starting back with the Emanuel administration, we had going into Mayor Emanuel's time a commitment to build 100 miles of protected bike lanes. We saw about a quarter of those actually get built. Likewise, now Mayor Lightfoot, made a similar commitment to have 50 miles of protected bike lanes built. We haven't seen a level of investment that's gonna meet that goal. That said, though, both the commitment to adding 12 new miles, which is going to be a 50% improvement over what we've already had, is a big step forward for the city. And really importantly, having these dedicated local resources that the city has put together through its capital plan is something that we've been calling for a long time, because it really enables the city to be a lot more flexible in figuring out how and where they can use those dollars.
And could you rank the, I guess, safest type of protected bike lane, or why, if it's safer to have a concrete barrier to protect a bike lane, then why do some places get the, uh, vertical delineator baller type things? Because I've seen trucks run over those protections, and that doesn't seem quite helpful. It's rare, but yeah, how from your perspective, I guess, how is it decided which type of protection goes into a protected bike lane?
Yeah, I think ideally, right, the more robust car impermeable and truck impermeable infrastructure is good. And I think it's worth saying too, a lot of these concrete curb bike lanes they're in place around the city, so not around the world. So in terms of access and snow removal and emergency vehicles, all these, sometimes we hear about the potential downsides of having this infrastructure, but they work around the world in all different kinds of settings. But I think in terms of the ideal level of protection is having either what they call a grade separated, so being totally on a different level, somewhere between the sidewalk and between where cars travel, or having that vertical separation with a curb or another permanent hard element like that. But at the same time, there are very, very real and practical considerations that we know, city officials and planners have to make in terms of available budget and how can we build out a network rapidly while still providing the highest quality. So these are the type of policy and planning decisions that we think are really important for us to be able to pull out into the public and make sure that we're having a really robust and transparent discussion, because it's important for us to understand kind of how these trade-offs play out. But what we've seen to date is much more a reliance and a strategy of having these, what they call the post and paint, so using paint and these vertical delineators to build out protected bike lanes as quickly as possible, with the intent of going back and upgrading them to more permanent infrastructure. And we've seen this happen in a few places. So downtown on Dearborn, there's a protected bike lane there that received a big upgrade a couple years ago with new concrete curbs, and the same thing on parts of Milwaukee Avenue. But we haven't seen a strategy to follow through on similar upgrades throughout the network. And like you said, there are maintenance and other issues with the current approach that, if they're not addressed on an ongoing basis, can make the protected bike lane feel less comfortable and safe for people. And ultimately, why are we talking about protected bike lanes? It's not just because we think they're cool, but it's the kind of safe and comfortable infrastructure that's going to actually shift behavior and get people who might be interested in riding a bike actually use it day to day as a part of their daily transportation choices. And so if we're creating that safe, low stress, all ages and abilities network, we can actually help unlock a lot of the sustainability and equity and health benefits that less car centric mobility can bring us.
And I want to kind of go back. You mentioned that like obviously the some of the protected bike lane infrastructure can get installed more quickly than say a permanent, I guess, concrete barrier. So I live close to the Logan Boulevard. I live close to Logan Boulevard, and there's a new, protected bike lane there. And I felt like that got stood up super quickly. Like I basically blinked one day and there is a, protected bike lane. Why do you find in advocacy work that it's harder to, I guess, maybe fast track some of those projects, or is it harder to build bike lanes in like different areas of the city, or is it like there's so many, you have to work with the alderman, you have to work with CDOT? Are there just a lot of moving parts in what it takes to get a new bike lane or a different type of bike lane installed in different areas of the city?
Yeah, we had my colleague Kyle Whitehead had a great blog post laying out kind of like the 4 big barriers to building out protected bike lanes earlier this year, if folks are interested in looking that up on our website. But it does boil down to a lot of what you're saying. So we, obviously funding and available resources is one. We know now that the city has this new capital investment available, so that's kind of at least temporarily less of a barrier. Something we could talk about is the role that the state plays in controlling a lot of our main roadways, particularly a lot of the barrier roadways. And then there's also just the capacity of the Department of Transportation, and the fact that they can only have capacity to manage a certain number of projects, given their staffing and other resources. And then there's the community and political buy-in and support, which in Chicago, like you said, often because our aldermen play what I would describe as maybe an outsized role in making decisions about the public right-of-way. We've seen a dramatically uneven implementation of not just bike lanes, but other types of street improvements throughout the city, right? So when we talk about transparency and accountability as like an equity strategy, making sure that we really understand how decisions are being made and who's making them, and it's not there aren't a lot of the traditional Chicago gatekeepers shutting down projects before they can happen. It's a big reason why we need to have a much more kind of transparent planning process, which we have seen. To CDOT's credit, they have taken some good steps in this direction. This past year, they did some really dedicated, focused neighborhood level outreach, and followed by immediate implementation of new bike lanes in high need areas on the west side of the city. And so that's a good example of the level of resources needed to actually engage communities in kind of meaningful input and engagement. So now the question is, how can we scale that up in a way that's going to help move the needle citywide? Because if we're only going one neighborhood at a time, we're still going to be a long way off from having the network that we need to actually shift behavior.
Yeah, I know months ago I was talking to one alderman and I was asking, like, do you think there are enough bike lanes in your ward, in your greater community? And he said something like, well, people don't bike in my ward. And then it kind of begged the question of like, well, one, you don't have eyes on every street at all times, so I'm sure someone in your ward at some point is biking. Two, are people not biking because they don't have a safe place to bike, and would they bike if they did? And yeah, it's I think the pushback from aldermen is interesting, and I've heard, at least two aldermen say, like, I don't like the protected bike lanes in my ward because they don't get cleaned at the same time, or cleared, maybe, of, like street cleaning would happen or snow plowing would happen. They don't get um, cleared at the same time as the car portion of the street does. And I mean, I'm not like an engineer or anything, but that just sounds like maybe the city needs more bike lane sweepers, or they need to be timed better, or I don't know, but like,
Yeah, it's certainly not an insurmountable problem, right? And we've heard this is and it's with any infrastructure. It's just building it is one thing, but then maintaining it and keeping it functional is an entirely different thing. And when you're a more vulnerable roadway user, like someone on a bike, it's even more important than when you're driving in a car. And so unfortunately, yeah, we have seen places where snow removal and removing debris, Lake Street, the protected bike lane on Lake Street on the west side is kind of a notorious example of a lot of debris and glass. The city does have equipment to sweep out those bike lanes, but despite this being a persistent issue that we've kind of brought up, kind of maintaining the level of maintenance that I think folks expect and deserve has been a struggle. But again, this gets back to one of the bigger structural areas is also the capacity of the city to support these types of investments. And so it's not just having $17 million for protected bike lanes, it's also having investments in the community outreach infrastructure to build the relationships and understanding so people are able to participate and see their desires reflected in the outcomes. And also in all the other services like maintenance and there are small sweepers that fit into protected bike lanes. We should get more of those.
I want to see one. I don't think I've ever seen one, and I would love to see this like miniature street sweeper.
So all these things are within like we have the technology. Again, it's just kind of like, are we providing the resources? And so while we've seen some exciting the announcement around the 100 miles. This great new neighborhood focused strategy where we're seeing rapid delivery of projects and 12 growing our protected bike lane network by 12 miles. All that is really great. It's all a good step in the right direction. But we really need to be seeing more if we're going to be kind of moving the needle and capturing, particularly over this last 18 months and the way mobility has been wildly disrupted with the pandemic. And you're seeing more and more people who are going to be wanting to use protected bike lanes because they're not just on their own bikes, they're also using the new e-Divvies that are wildly popular. Divvy had another record-setting year. We're going to have another 2-year scooter pilot, right? They need a safe place to ride. So more and more we're seeing more demand kind of growing for alternative mobility, and I think we're seeing that kind of community and political support reflect that. But at the end of the day, with 50 wards, we have to have leadership and kind of a coherent citywide strategy. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to put a network together, which is what we have to do. We don't build our train lines or our bus routes ward by ward.
That would be a mess, I'm sure. You talked a little bit about, community input and transparency. And I know that was part of something that Active Trans was looking for, after the plans for the capital plan came out. And I know that, the mayor has advisory councils on bikes and pedestrians. And those advisory committees, to my knowledge, have still not met since the beginning of the pandemic. So have you heard anything from, like, I guess, CDOT or the mayor's administration about, greater community involvement and how, I don't know, organizations like Active Trans might become more involved in implementing, these new bike lanes?
Yeah, and I mean, we obviously have we have plenty of opportunity to weigh in. So I think it's really, lifting up the voices of folks who are most impacted by transportation inequity, either being stuck in a car or not having access to a car and needing that to access a job or education. And in Chicago, that's largely Black and brown people on the south and west sides. But yeah, we haven't the Mayor's Bicycle Advisory Council or the Pedestrian Advisory Council have not met, and I'm not sure if there's an official announcement, but I think we're it seems to be moving on. The city did, the Department of Transportation did put out a new strategic plan over the summer, which talks about a couple of things. I mentioned, this neighborhood-based bike planning strategy, which involves, establishing kind of a community advisory group to help inform the entire process and help provide input on outreach strategy and actually connecting in more meaningful ways with people where they are. So that's a great model, and I think something that it would be great to see more resources growing and additional skills and staff being brought to support that kind of work. And the strategic plan also identified adding like a senior level staff person at the Department of Transportation, specifically focused on community engagement. And so what does that mean in terms of other staffing or resources for the agency? I think it's to be seen because we haven't gotten an update on the status of that position yet. But obviously that's one thing that we're going to be watching closely to see, who that person is and what type of impact they can have. Because what we've suggested and have seen, some other cities, Minneapolis or Seattle come to mind, is really having dedicated staff working on outreach kind of longitudinally. So not project. Right now, it's very project oriented. So when the city is gonna do something in a neighborhood, they'll go and talk to folks about it. Sometimes if it's a big capital project with lots of dollars, there are consultants and workshops and other things that can happen. More often than not, it's smaller projects, right, where people don't even know that it's part of a longer term plan or whatever. So having more dedicated staff and resources where we can be building more of an ongoing dialogue between folks who are making decisions and the folks who are actually living in the community is kind of the model. So we haven't seen that yet. That's kind of our vision for where we would like to see the direction. But this identification of a new staff person is a big outcome. And then Active Transportation Alliance is a part of a coalition called the Transportation Equity Network, which is led by more than 40 different organizations, community-based groups, more kind of regional civic groups like ours, academics, others, really working to try and bring racial equity into every transportation decision in the region. And so that group played a big part in informing the strategic plan. And so there's a lot in there that is really positive in terms of commitments to equity and transparency and community engagement. And again, that was just released in the summer. So there was a commitment from the city to work with the Transportation Equity Network and its stakeholders on continuing a dialogue around the implementation of that plan. So whether that becomes, a new MBAC or MPAC or some other kind of formal accountability body is, I think to be determined. But it's like the kind of thing right now that I think we as advocates need to be focused on really laying out for the city what we think meaningful accountability should look like.
Mm-hmm. And I guess circling back to the capital plan, and we've mentioned this number a few times, the $17 million that's dedicated to bike lanes. $17 million is a lot of money, but it's 1.2%, I believe, of the total capital plan. What does that say, I guess, about the city's priorities? Should there be a greater portion of that dedicated to bikes? I mean, we're looking at this in a silo, so there's also money, right, for other non-car initiatives, but should there be a greater priority, we always hear budgets are moral documents. I've heard that like 50 times, surely, in the past few weeks. So what does that say, I guess, about the priorities? And is it growing? Is it moving in the right direction? Should there be more money dedicated to the specific mode of transportation?
Yeah. So, I mean, absolutely, it's not enough, but it is more dedicated local dollars than we've had in a long time. A lot of the bike improvements around the city is paid for largely through federal grants, which have also some local resources making up a smaller part of that, things like menu money or TIF. So the city having its own kind of dedicated pot to where it's really key to being able to implement a more equitable biking strategy, because they're able to control how and where they're going to deploy those resources. But yeah, you're right. It's absolutely, I mean, it's outrageous, the lack of the disparity between our investment in alternative modes and car-oriented modes, even now in 2021, when right, we're starting this big climate summit this weekend in Glasgow. We're told we've got 10 years. This is the decade we have to make a difference. And yet we still have, the Jane Byrne interchange going on for another 4 years until we're done building that $750 million boondoggle. And there are similar, highway investments programs still throughout the region, right, to the tune of billions of dollars. So yeah, it's kind of, it's we obviously have to make our case and be persuasive where we can be. But if you step back, it's hard not to get kind of a little indignant about complaints about how much we're investing in biking, walking, or transit compared to the big picture stuff. Hopefully this is going to change. We're seeing more investment again from we hope this commitment from this capital plan is something that we're going to be able to maintain into the future. So we have ongoing dollars. That would be a huge thing. We've seen a similar move from the state of Illinois, where they now have a new $50 million in state resources dedicated every year for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And then likewise, right, everything happening right now in DC also includes, potentially really transformational amounts of resources for walking, biking, and transit. And so I think putting the protected bike lane conversation in that broader context of, how are we building a more resilient and adaptive city, given, the looming threat of climate change and the ongoing legacy of environmental racism in Chicago. It's really important, because it's like now we have to make the decisions right now, and we also have resources kind of coming in at an unprecedented level. So it's an exciting time, but we also have to really kind of be getting it right.
This episode of the Cloutcast was produced by me, Erin Hegarty, and edited by Joel Ebert. We'll have another episode of the Cloutcast ready for your listening ears in 2 weeks. See you later.